Hi and welcome. I came across something that stopped me almost immediately. Photos of Soviet fighter pilots standing next to American-built aircraft. Not captured ones, not reverse-engineered ones, actual planes built in the United States. Machines like the P-39 Airacobra. And not in tiny numbers either. Thousands of them. Now, on one level, that is not surprising. The United States sent enormous amounts of material to the Soviet Union during World War II through Lend-Lease. Trucks, food, aluminum, locomotives, aircraft. But the more I looked at it, the stranger one part became. How do you get a fully assembled fighter plane from an American factory to the Soviet front? Because sending canned food is one thing, and sending a fighter aircraft across half the world is something else entirely. At first, I assumed the answer was obvious. You take the plane apart, put it in a crate, load it onto a ship, send it across the ocean, and then assemble it again on the Soviet side. That is how a lot of wartime material moved. But the deeper I went, the less that explanation seems to fit, because a surprising number of those aircraft were not just shipped, they were flown. Flown north, through Alaska, across the Bering Strait, and then through Siberia. Which raises a much better question. What kind of war operation can take American fighters, hand them to Soviet pilots, and send them across some of the most remote territory on Earth? That story begins with a simple assumption, and then with the realization that the obvious answer does not really work. If you're trying to deliver aircraft in wartime, shipping seems like the sensible answer. In many cases, it was. Aircraft could be dismantled in American factories, packed into crates, loaded onto ships, and then reassembled after arrival. And some planes did reach the Soviet Union that way. But once you look at the timing, the route, and the conditions of the war, the shipping solution starts looking a lot less reassuring. German submarines were attacking Allied shipping, and Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union were especially dangerous. Even when ships made it through, the process was slow. And slow was exactly what the Soviet Union could least afford after Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The Red Air Force needed replacement aircraft quickly. American factories could build them. The real bottleneck was transportation. And this is the part that changed the story for me. The problem was not simply production, it was geography, or more precisely, the way we usually imagine geography. Because on a normal world map, the United States and the Soviet Union look like two giant states on opposite sides of the planet. So, of course, the aircraft must have crossed oceans. That is the mental model. And then you look north. Before getting to the Arctic route itself, it helps to understand that the Allies were not trying to solve a transportation problem from scratch. There were already ways to move aid into the Soviet Union. One was the famous Arctic convoy route, with ships sailing to northern Soviet ports under constant threat from submarines, aircraft, and brutal weather. Another was the so-called Persian Corridor, running through the Persian Gulf and Iran, which became enormously important for moving trucks, food, fuel, rail equipment, and other bulk supplies. And there were Pacific shipments too, though those came with their own political and practical constraints. So this is not a story where everyone somehow forgot ships existed. The real issue is that different routes were good at different things. Cargo ships were excellent for moving volume. They could carry huge amounts of material. But if you needed a fighter aircraft ready to fly as quickly as possible, the logic changed. A plane shipped in a crate still had to be unloaded, transported onward, unpacked, assembled, tested, and integrated. That takes time, labor, tools, and stable transport conditions on the receiving side. And in wartime, every one of those steps can become a bottleneck. So the more I thought about it, the more the question became less, why not use ships, and more, what do you do when ships are not enough? What do you do when you need speed, not just tonnage? That is where the map starts to matter. Once you rotate the map toward the Arctic, the whole problem changes shape. The United States and the Soviet Union do not just face different oceans. At one point, they come startlingly close to touching. At the Bering Strait, Alaska and Siberia are separated by only about 80 kilometers. And suddenly the question is no longer, how do you ship aircraft across half the world? It becomes, could you move them across the top of it? From factories in the United States, up through North America, into Alaska, across the Bering Strait, and then west through Siberia. That was the idea behind Alsib, pronounced Alsib, the Alaska-Siberia Air Route. And on paper, it almost sounds elegant. If ships are vulnerable and slow, then fly the aircraft directly. Skip disassembly, skip crating, skip reassembly. Just deliver the machine by air. But that elegant idea contained one brutal complication. For much of this route, there was barely a route. The Alsib project began operating in 1942, and its logic was straightforward. Aircraft built in the United States would be flown north through the American interior and Canada until they reached Fairbanks, Alaska. Fairbanks became the key handoff point. American pilots brought the aircraft there, and Soviet pilots took them the rest of the way. That detail alone tells you what kind of operation this was. This was not just a shipping lane. It was a relay system spanning 2 continents. From Fairbanks, Soviet crews flew the aircraft west, across Alaska, over the Bering Strait, and then deep into Siberia. But the route could not simply be declared into existence. It had to be built. Airfields had to be expanded in Alaska, and on the Soviet side, airfields were built or improved across Siberia in places like Yakutsk, pronounced Yakutsk, Samchan, pronounced Samchan, and Kirensk, pronounced Kirensk. These were not major aviation hubs waiting to be plugged into a network. Many were isolated settlements in forests, tundra, and extreme cold. Runways had to be cleared. Weather stations had to be established. Navigation support had to be improvised, extended, or installed from scratch. And once you start listing all of that, the scale of the thing changes. Because you realize this was not just a route for airplanes. It was a route for fuel, mechanics, spare parts, radios, meteorological information, maintenance crews, and procedures for handing aircraft from one air force to another. In other words, before the route could move aircraft, it had to create its own infrastructure. And only then could the real test begin. Because drawing a line across the Arctic on a map is one thing, but flying it in a single-engine fighter is something else. I think one of the most interesting parts of this story is that it was also a meeting point between 2 very different military systems. In Fairbanks, the aircraft arrived from one world and left into another. American pilots ferried them north. Soviet pilots took possession of them for the westbound journey. There is something strangely vivid about that handoff. A plane rolls in from the North American side of the war economy, built in an American factory, ferried through the continent, checked, fueled, and then turned over to a Soviet crew that will take it across Alaska and Siberia toward the Eastern Front. And after that point, the machine is no longer just an American product. It becomes part of the Soviet war effort. That kind of transition sounds simple when you say it quickly, but it implies a lot underneath it. Documentation has to match. Fueling has to be coordinated. The aircraft has to be accepted in working condition. Pilots need familiarity with the machine they are about to fly into some of the harshest operating conditions on Earth. And the transfer has to happen again and again and again if the route is going to matter at scale. That is another reason this story is compelling. It was not a one-off stunt. It was repetition. A wartime system is not impressive because it works once. It is impressive because it keeps working. Now imagine what this looked like from inside the cockpit. A pilot in the early 1940s flying across Siberia with no GPS, limited radio navigation, patchy weather information, and long distances between airfields. And then add winters where temperatures could fall below -50 degrees Celsius. That kind of cold does not just make flying unpleasant. It starts breaking the system around you. Oil thickens. Hydraulic systems struggle. Metal becomes less forgiving. Engines can refuse to start at all. At some airfields, ground crews used a solution that sounds almost primitive. They lit small fires beneath the engines to warm the oil before startup. Even navigation could become an exercise in stubbornness, with pilots relying on compasses, maps, rivers, mountain ranges, and whatever visibility the weather would allow them. And then there is the scale of the emptiness. When people hear that a route crossed Alaska and Siberia, it can sound abstractly large. But for a pilot, that size meant long legs between points of support, very little margin for error, and the persistent knowledge that if something went badly wrong, you were in an environment that did not forgive mistakes. Weather could close in. Visibility could disappear. Mechanical problems could become survival problems. And despite all of that, the route kept moving aircraft west again and again. That is what makes the operation feel less like a clever geographic shortcut and more like a triumph of endurance and system building. Many of the aircraft moving through this system were P-39 era Cobras, which adds another twist to the story. In the West, the P-39 often developed a poor reputation, especially when measured against the demands of high-altitude air combat. But wars do not ask every aircraft to solve the same problem. What looks disappointing in one theater can look useful in another. On the Eastern Front, much of the fighting that mattered to Soviet pilots took place at lower altitudes, in conditions where the aircraft's strengths could be used more effectively. So this strange northern corridor was not just delivering planes, it was delivering aircraft that could actually become useful in the kind of war the Soviets were fighting. And I think that matters because it shows that logistics is never just about movement. It is about fit. Can you get the right material to the right theater under the right conditions quickly enough for it to matter? That is a more demanding question than simply asking whether aid was sent. Aid can exist on paper and still arrive too late, in the wrong form, or in a way that creates new bottlenecks. Alsib matters because it helped compress that gap between production and use. Between 1942 and 1945, nearly 8,000 aircraft were delivered to the Soviet Union through the Alsib route. Fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, all of them moving across Alaska and Siberia through an air corridor that most people have never heard of. And this is where the meaning of the story gets bigger than the route itself. When people talk about war, they usually talk about battles, generals, tactics, and turning points. But large wars are also contests between systems: industrial systems, transport systems, repair systems, fuel systems. The Soviet Union still had to fight. Lend-Lease did not fight the war for them. But Soviet leaders later acknowledged that Allied supplies, including vehicles, raw materials, and aircraft, mattered. And Alsib was one of the mechanisms that made some of that support usable at speed. And that phrase, usable at speed, is really the heart of it. A factory output is not the same thing as battlefield capability. A finished aircraft sitting in the wrong place is still, strategically speaking, in the wrong place. What turns industrial output into military power is the system that moves, fuels, repairs, transfers, and sustains it. Not glamorous, not cinematic in the usual sense, just an enormous logistical machine solving a geographic problem under wartime pressure. Which is why I think this route matters. It shows how victory can depend not only on who has weapons, but on who can move them, maintain them, and place them where they are needed before it is too late. Today, when most people imagine World War II aviation, they picture dogfights over Europe or carrier warfare in the Pacific. They do not usually picture a transfer point in Fairbanks. They do not picture Soviet pilots taking possession of American fighters at the edge of Alaska. They do not picture a line of aircraft moving west into Siberia through cold, distance, and near-empty landscapes. But that happened for years, at scale. And that, to me, is what makes Alsib so interesting. It is not just a forgotten wartime route. It is a reminder that military power is never only about the battlefield. It is also about the hidden architecture behind the battlefield. The routes, the depots, the weather stations, the mechanics, the pilots moving machines across places most people would never willingly fly through. And maybe that is also why stories like this fade so easily. Battles are dramatic. Maps with arrows are dramatic. Famous commanders are dramatic. Logistical systems, when they work, tend to disappear into the background. But for 3 crucial years of World War II, high above the Arctic wilderness, a quiet air bridge connected American industry to the Soviet war effort. Not dramatic in the way history usually remembers things, but important in exactly the way history often forgets.